Our next speaker creates art with data, algorithms, and artificial systems. His work, cutting edge of technology, and explores new ways for a human to interact with the world around them. Among the project he worked on, AI-generated Rembrandt and painting done using butterflies. His work has been shown in galleries, museums, art fairs across the globe, and he's a frequent international keynote speaker, speaking about his art and about his vision of technology. Please give a warm applause to our guest speaker, the artist Most.
Yeah, thank you. Great introduction. Great to see you all tonight here. Really enjoying to be able to speak to you tonight. We've been in Saudi Arabia for a couple of days now and really enjoying our stay. It's a beautiful country and we really enjoyed some of the best dinners already, I think are possible in Saudi Arabia. So we really love it. Also like to thank the organization, of course, for having me here to do this talk. It's called, well, actually there are two names circulating for this talk at the moment. The first one is Transcendental Technology and the other one is Analog First Again. And that's basically because we're gonna show or we're gonna watch some of my work. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the artworks that I created over the past 10 years and slowly we'll enter into a journey which is sort of about transcending into the analog world. So let's just get started and let's have a look at the first artwork that I'd like to show you, because this will give you a little bit of a background on how I started my career as an artist. And this is an art piece that I actually created something like 12 years ago. And it's actually an artwork inspired, digitally created, inspired on Van Gogh's Starry Night. And it actually shows a city, the skyline of a city in New Zealand. And it was actually an art piece that I created using algorithms. And it's built up out of all these little texts, of which you see a little detail on the right of the artwork. And these actually are Twitter messages. Because before becoming an artist, I worked as a data scientist and used all sorts of algorithms to study how people were talking online, on social media, for example Twitter, how they were talking there about all sorts of societal issues. And at some point, I wanted to create something new using those same algorithms and started to create these artworks. These were called Twitter paintings back then. And actually this artwork, which was one of the first artworks that I created using that technology, was actually added to the collection of the National Historic Museum of New Zealand a while later. And this really showed me that if you combine human creativity with these newer emerging technologies, algorithms, that you could really inspire people literally on the other side of the world, because I was living in Amsterdam back then. And just a little bit later, after I started creating these paintings, I was in a museum in New Zealand on the other side of the world. So basically, 2 years later, I started using algorithms, not only the Twitter messages, but I started to use algorithms to make calculated paintings. So what I created, for example, was this painting, and it's called The Average Rembrandt. It's actually a calculation of how the average Rembrandt would look like, because to a computer, images, like for example a picture of a Rembrandt, is built up out of pixels, and each pixel for a computer is just a color number. And this means we can calculate averages of paintings. It's like you see all the Rembrandts at once, the average Rembrandt. And from that experience with the average Rembrandt, I decided that it might be interesting if I wouldn't calculate just the averages of the paintings of a certain old master, but actually make predictions, sort of statistical estimations of what a new painting by a famous old master would look like. And this technology is sort of like, it's on the edge of still what we call AI, artificial intelligence today. It was the newest technology in 2013, and I used it to analyze all the paintings Vincent van Gogh, the famous Dutch painter, ever made. And based on these algorithms, I studied all the themes in the artworks, all the topics, all the colors, all the shadows, all the highlights. And I made this prediction of what a new Van Gogh might have looked like if Vincent would have made one extra more painting. And what I started to experiment with at that point was to actually combine these digitally created images with real paints and lacquers. So to add a sort of analog layer to these digitally created images. And that's what you see me doing on the right there. It's actually me adding paints and lacquers to these digitally created printed images. Because what I really like about real paintings, and this is a minor detail of a real Van Gogh, is that the paint, the lacquers, this has this really complex, this huge complexity to it. So if you really look in detail to a painting, you see all these little textures and these little differences in shininess, in color. And this really adds this extra layer to a digitally created image. It really adds some brilliance, a sort of energy to a painting, which really makes it come alive. 2 years later, it's basically 2016 now, I worked, based on this experience with this new painting of Van Gogh, I worked in a project on actually creating a new Rembrandt painting. So this is again based on artificial intelligence. We studied the whole oeuvre of the famous painter Rembrandt and actually predicted a new Rembrandt painting. And this again was, we were looking for this analog way of presenting it, to add some extra brilliance to it, and we 3D printed this painting. So it has this kind of like impasto a real Rembrandt has, which makes this painting just more real than just a digitally created image. So the press at that moment was really interesting, because worldwide publicity for the next Rembrandt, the press was saying at that point, hey, isn't this artificial intelligence? Isn't artificial intelligence taking over human creativity? Isn't this the end of the human artist because we have AI now? Well, that's truly not the case. In reality, artists working with artificial intelligence are actually more co-creating, cooperating with computer systems, because it's still the human artist who builds these systems, who tweaks these systems, who curates the output, etc. So it's more of a cooperation than AI taking over. And this was actually the basis for me to create this painting. This idea of an evolution of creativity. So this is not a painting or a digitally created image. It's a digitally created image, but it's not created by AI. It's a combination, a digital collage of these images, parts, elements of, again, these famous Dutch old masters, these analog masters, combined with creatures that are actually created by artificial intelligence. So the bird-like creatures in the left and right bottom part of this painting, they're actually created by AI. So how does that work? Well, these AI systems, I will show such a system, for example, 20,000 pictures of birds. And the AI will start to analyze what statistically, in numbers, these birds are. So it will start to learn in some way what the shape of a bird is, what the textures of a bird are, that it has these feathers, and that it has these little legs beneath it. And from that knowledge, if it understands what a bird visually is, it can create new birds. And these birds are still far from perfect, although the evolution of AI is increasingly to more perfect imagery. This also, again, a printed image. It's printed on cloth in this case, and actually I added all sorts of pigments and actual paints to it to, again, create that analog feel. So sort of my work is this combination or this exploration of the digital and the analog. But it's also a metaphor. You could see this division between the digital and the analog as a sort of metaphor for the rational versus the natural world. Because that divided world of the rational versus the natural is one of the most important themes in my work. What I explore is how people, like us, often have divided the world into certain concepts, into boxes. So we think we are human, and there are trees and our animals and our landscapes and objects. And we think these objects and these animals, these trees, these landscapes are different from us. And you could wonder if that's not an illusion. Isn't it in some sort of way more real, or isn't reality in a certain way one? Aren't we just part of one big natural world in the end? And what I explore in my work for over the past 4 or 5 years is actually study how we can use artificial intelligence, newer technologies, to actually break these illusionary boundaries we have in our minds. For example, like this division between us and nature. And what I do with these technologies like AI is actually see how we can deepen the relationships between these entities. So for example, between the human and nature. So what does that mean? What does a deeper relationship, what would that mean? Well, it could, for example, mean that I would use artificial intelligence, create a system that would enable humans in some sort of way to create an art piece together with, in this case, butterflies. So what I did was create a system, build a system, an AI system, that's capable of following butterflies when they fly around. And draw all these lines based on how they fly through the air. So let's have a short look at this, just 30 seconds. This is an art piece that I created in 2017, and in some way you could see it as a sort of cooperation between a human creating ideas, between AI and butterflies flying around, a sort of natural creativity. Another piece that I'd like to show you, artwork, is an artwork that I created basically last year, at the beginning of this year. It's called The Spirit Machine. And what we did there was that I worked together with the Dutch University, Radboud University, the AI department there, with PhD candidate Gabrielle Ras. And we created an AI system that's capable of writing text. So generating texts as if you could imagine that a human would have written them. And what the system does, it's shown on a big screen, like this 4-meter wide screen. It's actually producing all sorts of new inspirational quotes. So motivational lines of text inspired on the work of Maria Montessori. And if you don't know Maria Montessori, she's the founder of the Montessori education system, which is, well, kind of very short based on the philosophy that kids will learn at schools when they're ready for it, on their initiative. But it's broader than that. It's also a work, an oeuvre of Montessori that's really about also connection to our surroundings, about awareness of the outer world. I'll show you a little bit of footage about of this artwork, just to give you a feeling of what kind of text this system produces. So every child is born with a natural love of learning. It's our job to help them develop it. So this is actually a new line of text. It's not something that Montessori wrote before. There's actually a version. Most of my artworks exist in multiple versions. This version is one version in Holland at this Dutch university, which will create motivational text like this, inspirational text for a year. This is a version that is in the USA, in Philadelphia. And a company called Foundry built it, which who specialize in creating these kind of analog screens to display text. So let's have one more look at another quotation. So in this case, the child who doesn't show awareness of the world about them is like a prisoner in their cell. They has no freedom, they cannot move. So this is a little bit exemplary of how the system not only produces sort of motivational text and kind of brings the past into the now again using this futuristic AI technology, but it's actually also about bringing a certain value system into the present again, a value system from longer ago that is about this connection to the natural world. It's this analog natural world that really inspires me in all my work. So this surprisingness, this complexity that you find in the natural world, like I showed you at the beginning in this little piece of Van Gogh, but it's also the complexity that you recognize in even the smallest piece of rock or piece of bark of a tree if you study it from really up close. It's the vastness of, for example, these starry nights that really is beyond human comprehension. It's and actually the starry nights I've seen here in Saudi Arabia must really be some of the most beautiful in the world. So that's really a topic. These starry nights, I would really love to do an art piece about them in the future. So maybe more about that in the future. But if we think about this analog starry nights, this analog world filled with complexity, wouldn't it then also be interesting if we would create an artwork that is actually about generating the feeling among spectators that they're transcending into this natural world, that they could see to some extent, feel to some extent that they're part of this natural world. Well, that was what I've been working on quite recently. It's an artwork that I created half a year ago approximately for the company NVIDIA. And NVIDIA, if you don't know, NVIDIA is basically the biggest organization or the most important organization in the world who produce the technology, the graphic cards, the cards that actually do the calculations that most AI systems are using to function. And this art piece started with me collecting thousands of images from nature. Public domain images, so this is an art that's really based on the richness, the beauty of all public domain imagery of nature. So images of plants, images of landscapes, trees, animals, also pictures of humans, parts of humans like eyes, etc. And what the system does is actually creating transcendental journeys. So it will create endless animations in which the one picture transforms, morphs into the other. And it does so intelligently, because the system understands, based on image recognition technology, AI-based, what is shown in the pictures. So it will always transform, for example, a picture of a human into a picture of an animal, into a picture of a tree, etc. So it's constantly playing with our feeling or understanding of differences between the entities that we think exist in the world. It's trying to show that everything might just be one in the end, that everything is part of the same reality. And it can do so also quite complex. So it will recognize populations of humans, like you see on the screen, and recognize populations of birds, etc. Or see the shape of an ear and see, or understand to some extent that the shape is the same as the form, the shape of the caterpillar that you see on the right. So it's constantly creating these transformations, and the idea was that you would see these animations like you see on the screen right now. So this would be shown to people at events, actually screens wrapped in cloth, these analog cloths, and people could really sit down with the screens like 10, 15 minutes and then slowly start to get into this transformation and experience this transcendence into the natural world. Now, unfortunately, we don't have these 10 to 15 minutes, so I will show you a really short clip of this movie, just like 30 seconds. But it's maybe interesting to see if you could increase the impact of the movie a little bit and do a little exercise in attention, a sort of mental exercise, very shortly. See if you can increase the impact of the movie. So what I'd like to do is, I think we all paid attention, at least I hope, to what I was saying in this presentation. But could we now sort of try to shift our attention a little bit to our bodies? Do you actually feel how the chairs press against your legs? Can you feel there's pressure from the chair to your legs? And could you actually feel, if you breathe in and breathe out, that the air in this room is actually moving your chest? Now, if we shifted our attention now from basically the presentation to our bodies, could we then also shift our attention to the space in this room? So could you to some extent imagine that you're part of the space in this room? Or could you maybe even imagine to some extent that you are the air that fills this room? And if you shifted your attention then from my presentation to your body, to the air in this room, could you then also imagine that you are the blackness on the screen? So could you maybe even imagine to some extent that you're part of the blackness in the screen, actually embedded in this screen, in this blackness? Let's have a look at this movie now. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention to this presentation. It's great to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Artist, for... I called you Mr. Artist. I give you a new title.
Perfect, perfect. The artist, that's fine.
The artist most for the amazing... you gave me delusion because of the pictures together. So I actually would like to open the floor for questions from the audience, and I have myself a lot of questions as well. Do you have any questions? That section. أي سؤال؟
What did you use in that Starry Night painting by coding? Is it an application or what?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Or
What did you use in a Starry Night painting?
the first painting that I showed, totally at the beginning of the presentation.
It was coding, right?
Yeah, coding. Yeah, it's based on. It's actually quite funny. I actually used back then, like in 2009, 2010, actually used PHP to code that stuff. So actually create visualizations of Twitter messages. And it's quite interesting because at this point in time, you would probably never use PHP to do something like that. So most of what I'm doing today is actually use Python to program and stuff.
Oh, cool.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions from the audience? Here.
Hi, there's a quote that says, art is not supposed to look nice, it's supposed to make you feel things. Do you think art created in a collab with AI can still have the same emotional effect?
Yeah, I think to some extent it can, definitely, because it's still very much AI-based art is a cooperation between the human and AI systems. AI systems actually creating stuff on their own, it's an illusion, because there's always human input in these systems. So it's the human who built the systems, human creating data that are used, etc., etc. So in that way, there's always a human involved in the end, and emotion is definitely possible in AI-based art.
Thank you. So I have a question myself. Do you find AI-generated painting and art better than an art that's been done by natural artists? What do you prefer?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because you could always discuss, of course, if it's even possible to say that one sort of art form is better than the other.
Yeah.
But I do have a preference personally. Although I'm a big fan of, very big fan of Van Gogh painters like Van Gogh and Rembrandt, so the real old masters.
Yep.
I personally have a preference for conceptual art in the sense that art that is, well, it has to have a certain aesthetic component in it. It has to touch on emotion, But for me, it's really important as well that art is about ideas. So really about translating, exploring, speculating about new ideas. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do you have any more questions from this side? Let's go here. That's the mic.
Can this AI generate a bunch of pictures together and make it in like some sort of art, like maybe taking like sand and sea at the same time, like make it into a new thing?
Yeah, definitely. That's really cool. Yeah, because you can. I showed the example with the birds. So the birds, like in the left and right bottom corner of this painting, and that's really about just feeding it 20,000 pictures of birds. But actually, these systems are actually. It's very interesting to start experimenting with using different sorts of image input. So if you would combine, I don't know, human faces with bird-like imagery, then there will start to be generated all these cross breeds between humans and birds. So that's really interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
Amazing. Any more questions from the audience? There's one more here.
Hi, I wanted to ask what inspired the change from you being a data analyst to you using data to create art?
Well, what actually inspired me was that, well, basically at the point that I started to make the Twitter artworks was actually at some point I was reading a timeline on Twitter from someone and actually could read the emotions of the person and really read what the person had been doing. And this really inspired me to actually pursue something more creative with these algorithms, because all the studies that I did using these algorithms were actually, they were interesting, but on a purely rational level. And what I kind of missed in this was sort of the feeling aspect in that emotional aspect. And that was sort of me to, the reason to really step into experimenting with new creative forms using algorithms and Twitter messages. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That was actually a pleasant, talk. We learned a lot today about art and AI. Thank you so much, artist Most, for the enriching actually session. We will give a warm applause for our artist.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.